Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today at this conference. My name is Monica da Silva, and today I will present the article Integrating Privacy in Game Design Insights from the Pri4Gamers approach. This study was done with Viterbo and Salgado from Universidade Federal Fluminense in Brazil. The development of games addresses the use of various technologies and the integration of these technologies. It also addresses functionalities that are uncommon in gameplay software, resulting in a more enjoyable game. More interesting and sometimes even more addictive, they end up incorporating privacy issues or collecting personal data from players to make the game easier, to facilitate gameplay more fun and engaging. Therefore, this generates privacy risks for players, and developers often overlook these risks due to differences from legal standards, different from legal presentations. The laws establish that collecting sensitive data, including health, medical, biological, and psychological data, is not allowed without consent. Data that is sensitive and personal. But in the game, when you collect information individually, it may not bring sensitive data, but when aggregated or processed in a comprehensive way, they end up becoming sensitive data. The integration of this information deteriorates. Because of the challenges involved, the game integrates multiple technologies, and often the developers, the design teams creating games often rely on third-party platforms. Therefore, tools like Unity are commonly used along with data analysis tools, AI functions, and plugins for faster game creation. Thus, all of this sometimes entails data collection, and this is particularly concerning when games are made for children and seniors who are more at risk. In this context, data protection laws exist, but as noted, they sometimes fail to perceive these nuances of the games. A well-known example is the game Silent Hill, which, in a study conducted between 2015 and 2016, demonstrated that the game gathered player data to enhance its scare factor. He made inferences about the emotional and psychological profiles of players to enhance the game's difficulty and fear factor. This created sensitive psychological data on players. Thus, we recommended the Pri4Gamers approach, focusing on solutions that address privacy issues from the outset of creation, because it is easier to fix problems at this stage while also enabling designers to reduce costs for corrections. At the same time, we observed within our view of the literature and our interviews, challenges and opportunities for future research. As mentioned, we did a literature review, and this review showed that there are already some solutions proposed in the literature. Here I present 3. However, there are additional solutions focused on incorporating privacy by design into game development. A tool designed to incorporate GDPR into data integration processes. Therefore, there are other solutions aimed at protecting children, as well as additional privacy protection solutions, but still, when compared to software development solutions, the number of solutions for development of games is still much smaller. And among these gaps we have identified, we observe that integrating privacy into game design is quite challenging because of how individuals perceive privacy aspects and what defines a privacy problem, how to represent this to a player, how they will interpret these signals and warnings of issues. Thus, all of this leads to a privacy concern. The absence of training for teams or their lack of understanding is also an issue, as is the challenge of integrating with multiple platforms that can collect data without developers being aware and without notifying their players. Thus, designers must adapt and consider new ways to reflect and respond differently during the game development process. With this, we propose the Pri4Gamers approach, whose main goal is for designers to think and reflect on these design issues, especially in their initial stages. The creation of the initial game documentation in the game design document to create this from the conception of the characters, the creation of plots using effective thinking tools to decide which tools to use for the creation of the game. Pri4Gamers use 3 technologies: literature review, data production principles, and semiotic engineering. The phase to be analyzed in this study is the dialogue analysis phase, which will be discussed further on. As mentioned, Pri4Games was conceived with 3 theories, aggregating 3 areas of knowledge from the literature review, concerns, identified privacy issues, existing solutions, and principles of legislation, along with concepts from semiotic engineering. Semiotic engineering is derived from human-computer interaction. It is a theory within human-computer interaction where the designer is seen as someone who communicates with the player. Here, the designer conveys to the player through the game his intentions, what he desires, who he believes the player is, and what actions he wants the player to take, which was created for software development. But it has this game interpretation too. How the communication takes place between the designer and the game or software user, and how the user understands these symbols. The signals shown here on the left provide a straightforward example of a display featuring some of Apple's privacy labels, illustrating signals that Apple recommends using. But how these signs, will these signals be interpreted by players if you integrate them into the games? Will they be able to understand? So, semiotic engineering was integrated into this approach so that game developers consider whether the symbolism, warnings, and alerts they offer is truly understood by the player. As discussed, the approach has 4 stages. The first is preparation, where the team leader collects a set of data from the approach, either from the internet or videos, with examples of problems. Following that, he suggests an immersion for the teams, aiming to foster integration so they can grasp the reality of the situation. This allows them to recognize where the issues are for their players and to empathize with that position, initiating the dialogue and analysis of the game design documents related to their game. Beginning at that point, we will discuss and brainstorm to grasp and suggest solutions for your games, employing the strategy outlined in Pri4Games. They may reflect better on how to symbolize and present this data, even for the game developer, the person who will create and program the codes to understand better how to show this to the player. Finally, if there is dialogue and solutions are identified, they will determine what will be included and what will be excluded from the documentation process, marking another phase. Create a data mapping, create maps showing where the data is being collected and how the solution will be. This is a way to identify it directly in the game design document or in other game documents. This proposed methodology was evaluated through semi-structured interviews with 8 game developers, and this study was approved by the Research Ethics Committee of Brazil. The primary focus is to comprehend how designers perceive the reflection issues related to Pri4Games and to identify areas that could be enhanced, what could be improved and what could be done for this approach, as well as to support game developers. The analysis was conducted using content analysis. Following Bardham's study for categorization using the Atlas TI system, we initially presented the consent form to participants who then signed it. Afterward, they participated in interviews, all of which were recorded. The data was analyzed and the results were shared. An instance of this methodology showed that some participants, they did not directly address privacy in the GDDs they created, and a methodology was adopted for them to reflect on whether they had already considered it. Privacy beyond game development, if they had thought about it when they were also players, and then it became clear that they do reflect on privacy, but at the moment of game creation, they sometimes disconnect, so to speak, and they often overlook these issues. An example of a question that was asked was whether they had thought about it while playing the game, if the mechanics, the elements, the structures of the games that are mechanics. Elements and dynamics are common terms in game design. If they posed any privacy concerns and they requested examples, which included Pokemon games, where at certain times you can send a gift to another player, for instance, an item, and the recipient views the sender's data, thus they see personal information. Long ago, in the initial versions, children were permitted to play Pokemon and be exposed in parks, in physical locations, and various exposure problems occurred, including attacks, traffic accidents, and numerous situations involving the Pokemon game. It's a classic example of this. And then, among our findings, we observed that few designers considered privacy during the GDD conception phase. But one designer noted that they defer this control until after the game for other stages for the companies that offer the game, who believe that these companies will have the ability to manage privacy issues. And some challenges were observed during these interviews, such as the lack of training on legislation and what privacy is, how it can impact the game, the reliance on third-party solutions, a heavy dependence on tools created by others, and they explain This dependency arises because building a complete development framework from the ground up is quite challenging for a team, leading them to rely on these pre-existing solutions. And the absence of tools they can utilize, which indirectly clarifies the situation for them, explaining the issues and how they can perceive this. So they have few tools available, and the legislation is complicated, resulting in insufficient training with laws that are sometimes hard to comprehend, especially complex privacy policies. They also struggle to visualize this easily. And in addition to that, they face difficulties in symbolizing, notifying, and informing their players the privacy concerns present in the game, which makes it difficult for them to figure out how to convey this to the players. So we shared a list of pros and cons found, indicating that despite several positive points, they are worried about privacy issues, seeing them as ethical dilemmas. They need to comply with the laws, but they claim this raises game costs, lengthens development time, and complicates the game. That there is a problem in interpreting the laws, and that they also have limitations. That the industry itself sometimes may not be interested in addressing privacy issues within the game. The fact that data also has monetary value within games. Thus, the suggested approach has proven to be proactive, enabling designers to engage in reflection, even if not at all times, because there are situations they still cannot visualize due to lack of knowledge and experience. But it indeed assists them in considering these privacy challenges and integrating them into the games. And that this reflection, as they also mentioned, needs more visual examples and real-life instances so they can use this and gain a better understanding of the privacy problem. So within our limitations, we observed that discussions with the participants, we noticed that they struggle to integrate these symbols, warnings, and human-computer interaction issues into the game's design. Even to avoid making the gameplay overloaded, they say they don't want to make the game too boring for players, but they also don't know how to achieve that. And this promotion and proactive thinking leads to issues related to privacy by design. This is always recommended as a best practice by legislation and various groups. This study involved just 8 participants from Brazil, so it doesn't represent a worldwide reality. There may be groups in other countries, in larger companies, in bigger developer groups, that handle privacy in a more extensive manner. One of the interviewees mentioned that even while working in Brazil, there wasn't much concern here, but they had worked with teams outside Brazil and observed that this was already being considered in other countries that were thinking about and demanding reflection on privacy in game development. And as mentioned, few of our participants, only 2 of them, had directly addressed privacy within game development. The majority thought about a few privacy concerns, but when it was time to create the initial game documents, they did not have that documentation. They didn't have this framework for thinking and didn't know where to start. In the document, they thought it would be better to document this and how to approach it. For instance, mapping these data. In our concluding thoughts, we observe that, as stated, this approach genuinely aids participants in contemplating privacy matters, to consider the problem. However, it is still an approach, an initial phase that requires further studies and a deeper understanding from game designers, because they must desire and pursue this to achieve their development goals. Therefore, this approach does help foster greater transparency, which could also provide better privacy protection for players in the future. But it needs to be addressed from the initial levels. Thus, we think that in future projects, we must extend this study beyond merely serving as a reflection tool and a point of inquiry in interviews, to conduct studies that include experiments directly related to game design development, testing the approach with various methodologies, with other structures, and also in a longer-term study to create games that integrate these concepts, these symbols, these signs, to understand how players interpret and recognize this, considering that it may also differ by region, culture, and even the colors and shapes of symbols may influence each player's interpretation. Thus, this is a study. These would be studies that would require a significant amount of time to be conducted to genuinely enhance privacy in games. But artificial intelligence solutions, enhancements in dialogues, and alerts for players can certainly be integrated right away, striving to safeguard players. In this case, I thank all participants. I am here for questions. My email is open for any future matters, and thank you very much.